Tariq Bashir, who is a research scholar at Center for Governance and Markets. Earlier, he was working with the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan. Next to him, Ahmad Shomabares, who has recently done his PhD at Kansas University, and currently he is a postdoc fellow at the Center for Governance and Markets. And last but not the least, Mirwais Parsa, who is also a research fellow at the Center for Governance and Markets. Earlier, he also worked with the Ministry of Finance in Afghanistan. To give a brief introduction about economics of Afghanistan, I think it's evident for almost everyone who follows Afghanistan that the country is experiencing a complex economic crisis with the natural disaster exacerbating the humanitarian condition that began prior to takeover of the Taliban. Based on certain data and statistics which have been given by different United Nations agencies, including the World Bank Food Program and the Food and Agriculture Organization, they warned that by November 2022, that we are now at around 18.9 million people, or near half of the population of Afghanistan, are estimated to face acute level of food insecurity. The United Nations Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs also estimated that around 4.7 million people will suffer from acute malnutrition due to food insecurity in 2022. And this is an increase of 21% compared to the last year. Equally, the recent report by the Special Reporter on Human Rights in Afghanistan noted that around 850,000 girls are out of school and they are not allowed to attend school in around 24 out of 34 provinces of Afghanistan. He also noted that around 17,300 women-owned businesses has already collapsed. And this, of course, with the collapse of these businesses, over 129,000 jobs were lost. So these are a couple of numbers which indicates what is the economics of Afghanistan at the moment. Now, this panel discusses the economics of Afghanistan after 1 year of rule of the Taliban. My colleagues will try to reflect on the political economy and institutional aspects of Taliban's regime, the fiscal management and service delivery, the current socio-economic condition in terms of poverty, education, and health. So if I start, probably I will ask Parsa to give the first presentation on macro-fiscal status of Afghanistan economy.
Thank you, Dr. Sadr, for the introduction, and thanks to Syrian for the platform. Let me start with some broad macroeconomic indicators of Afghanistan, and I'll be focusing mostly on the past 1.5 years, almost 14 months. As you see here, this figure here reflects the GDP of Afghanistan. The GDP actually started declining in 2020, and that was when the COVID-19 happened, and the economy of Afghanistan experienced some roughly 2 to 3% decline in GDP. But the major decline comes exactly in mid-2021 when the collapse happened, in 15th of August. In 2021, the economy at least shrank by 20%. And according to projection in 2022, the economy will further shrink by some 10 to 15%. So overall, there is, due to the collapse of Republic and rise of the Taliban over the past 14 months, the economy has shrunk by some 30 to 35%. And we are speaking about a very small open economy. The total worth of the economy was some roughly 20 billion before the collapse, and now that it has decreased by 35%, it is almost 14 to $14.5 billion, a very small one. So this collapse comes at no surprise, because it's a huge collapse, but it's mainly due to a reduction in all components of the aggregate demand, with no exception. For those of you who are not from an economics background, the GDP or aggregate demand consists of investment, household expenditure, government expenditure, and the net of international trade, and that's export minus imports. Now, over the past 1 year since the takeover of the Taliban, there has been a huge disinvestment trend in Afghanistan. Investment in private sector reduced by almost 35%, at least 400, according to a recent survey of the World Bank, at least 400 small scale to medium and large scale enterprises has shut down. And that translated to some loss of 50% employment in case of male employees of the private sector, and almost 75% decline in employment in the case of women, a huge disproportionate impact on women and girls in Afghanistan. That's one. And the second major decline in GDP is reflected from a reduction in household income. And that's, again, due to loss of employment in the private sector, and also a huge loss of employment for those who are working in the public sector. Some roughly 350,000 people were working in Afghanistan National Defense and Security Forces. That, with the rise of Taliban, they are fully unemployed. That's one. Second, those around roughly 400,000 people who are working in civil, in public sector, in civil sectors, for them, at least half of them lost jobs with the rise of the Taliban. So due to that, the household income significantly declined. And also, since the past 14 months, government expenditure has been significantly lower compared to the same period during the Republic. During the last year of the Republic, 2021, the government budgeted some $5 billion for the year. Now, for 2022, the Taliban budgeted only $2.2 billion. And that translates to less than 45% of the budget during the Republic. And also, the net of export and imports in Afghanistan, it has been deficit. Afghanistan was running a deficit international trade before, and that trend is still there. Though with the rise of the Taliban, exports a little bit picked up, which led to a transfer of balance of payment in favor of Afghanistan. But overall, Afghanistan is still running deficit. So therefore, due to reduction, significant reduction in all components of aggregate demand, you see this surprising fall in the GDP by 35% over just a matter of 12 to 14 months. And this translates to a significantly lower income per capita. Now, the income per capita of Afghanistan in August 2022 stands at some $350 only $350. And if you map it out, that reduction translates to the level that Afghanistan was in 2006. So in terms of income per capita, on average, Afghanistan has gone back at least by 16 years with the rise of the Taliban. In terms of inflation, Afghanistan has experienced a rapidly increasing inflation over the past few months. Well, this is part of this inflation is driven by the global inflation, but a major part of this is due to the supply side shock that happened with the collapse of the previous government and consequently the collapse of the economy under the Taliban. In terms of exchange rate, at least until late 2001, Afghanistan currency was rapidly deteriorating against major currencies, including dollar. But by the 12th of December, by mid-December, sometime in mid-December 2021, the UN started a series of weekly cash shipments to Afghanistan, highlighted here. And afterwards, you see that the economy, the exchange rate is somehow stabilizing. But despite that, it has lost some 6% value against US dollar, some 10% against Chinese yuan, but it has appreciated against some other major currencies in the region, like Pakistani rupee and Indian rupee and Iranian Tuman. I should not say that Afghanistan has appreciated. In fact, these other currencies depreciated, while Afghanistan somehow stabilized due to the cash shipment by the UN. Now, this figure tells a lot of story about the situation in Afghanistan. If this cash shipment was not there, I am strongly confident that Afghanistan would have been in a very different situation right now. Because by then, when the currency was depreciating sometime in late 2001, I was there in Kabul, and the situation was alarming. The currency was almost a piece of rubbish. The prices were rapidly increasing because Afghanistan economy is a very import-dependent economy. When your currency has no value against US dollar, then obviously that would mean higher prices in the domestic markets. But with the shipment of $40 million weekly by UN to the Taliban to Afghanistan, that has led to, in fact, two things. One, it has saved a lot of lives, no doubt. But at the same time, this shipment has saved the Taliban, their government. Because I believe that if these shipments of currency were not there, there would have been a huge uprising against the Taliban. The people would not have tolerated the Taliban government, nor would have they survived the increasing prices and inflation in those markets. So, and here is the status of international trade. As I just mentioned, with the Taliban takeover, exports has relatively improved here, and it is by the data which the World Bank has taken from the statistic department of the Taliban de facto government. It shows that increase in export is driven by food items, which I don't believe is true. Because since the rise of the Taliban, a major component of the export in Afghanistan has been an exhaustive extraction and selling of natural resources, including coal and other natural resources from Afghanistan. But imports has slightly reduced since the Taliban takeover, and that's obviously due to a number of reasons, including perhaps the challenges, problems around the transfer of money from Afghanistan to outside world, because Afghanistan financial sector was completely disconnected. It is still disconnected from the international financial system, and also because the domestic demand has significantly reduced, and that would mean that import will be lower. But as I mentioned, the balance is a little bit in favor of Afghanistan now, due to higher export and lower imports compared to the previous government. This is the status of financial sector right now. The Taliban's approach to regulate financial sector, which was obviously aided by consultants from World Bank and UN. So when they saw this rush over banks, they regulated the withdrawals, and they fixed a limit, a cap of $200 withdrawal weekly from personal accounts, and some 3,000 withdrawals from corporate accounts. But the point that I want to make here is that despite this limit, people were not able to withdraw at least that limit. And this was mainly because of a lot of rush on banks, and also because of some liquidity crunch which was there. So the people could not. This is and coming to fiscal sector, which is the most important one, I think. The Taliban. This graph shows that the Taliban has a little bit improvement in terms of domestic revenue mobilization. And some people, sympathizers of the Taliban mostly, would reflect on this a lot and say that, look, here the Taliban are performing better than the Republic, and therefore there should be engagement with them. But here, a lower domestic revenue generation by Republic compared to the Taliban, there's a lot of reasons behind it. And the most significant of those why the Republic was not able to mobilize revenue was the Taliban themselves. I remember in 2020 and 21, I was there in Ministry of Finance working closely with the Deputy Minister and Minister. there was no single week that the people from private sector and from the traders, they would not approach the minister for tax concession or tax exemptions. And their demand was very, very obvious, very clear. And they were saying that besides paying taxes to the government, we are paying twice of the tax, that amount to the Taliban. The Taliban had checkpoints during their insurgency time along all major highways in Afghanistan, and they were extracting and getting much more than the amount that the government was getting from the business sector. And they were saying that either the government should maintain security for us, or the government should reduce tax revenue, or otherwise they will shut down. So the Republic, being responsible to the people, they had to like exempt taxes or reduce significantly the tax amount. And that's why revenue mobilization during Republic was significantly lower. But the potential was there, and that potential was crippled by insurgency and by the Taliban themselves. That's the revenue side. So they are able to extract a lot from the economy, but are they giving back to the economy in terms of services? I think the answer is no for that because of many reasons. First, the Taliban has budgeted only $2.5 billion. And from this, just $0.3 billion is for development. In Afghanistan, which is a developing country, just this amount is allocated for development. And this is being spent mostly in reconstructing those roads and bridges that the Taliban themselves bombed during their insurgency. So technically, there is no development budget in Afghanistan right now, except a small portion, this one. When it comes to operating expenditure, a major part of the operating expenditure in Afghanistan was payment of the government salaries of the employees by the government. The employees were some 4,500 people, but from this figure, at least 203,000 were teachers, health workers, and some 90,000 were women. Now, with the rise of the Taliban, these guys, almost more than 50% are being paid by UN, and women are also not there in employment in the public sector. Those of them who are there, they are being paid only basic salaries, which is roughly amounts to $100 to $150 per month. So from all 400,000 people in the public sector, the Taliban are paying only half of it. And therefore, a lot of money is being saved for the Taliban government. Where does that money goes? That's a big question. Perhaps a lot of them goes to their security sector, and also goes to their leader in Kandahar that probably funds madrasas and jihadi networks within Afghanistan. So this is the situation. They are extracting a lot, but they are not giving back at the same amount, and therefore they are saving money for the strategic purposes that serve their interests. Just to,
I think time is finished. You can come up back to the second round.
okay.
Yeah. Now to Ahmad Shah, who will be talking about the welfare impact of state collapse in Afghanistan.
Have my stuff. Yes. You have your opinion?
It was there, yeah. Let me change it.
Sorry for the technical interaction. Thanks to the CBN and thanks to Dr. Omar for moderating the discussion today. I think Bartol set the stage quite well because I'm going to talk about welfare, and we heard about the macro fiscal aspect of state collapse and the takeover of the state in August of 2021. I'm going to talk about, as a result of the macro fiscal failure, what happens to the lives of people at the micro level. What happens to, specifically, I'm going to talk about what happens to people's daily earning, what happens to the health and education. I have to make a comment about the data source. I use predominantly the World Bank's recent survey of welfare survey of Afghan people. And this survey was conducted over the phone because the World Bank currently doesn't have a representation. They don't have an office in Afghanistan, and running in-person surveys, field surveys is not possible for the World Bank. So we have to interpret the results and the figures with a grain of salt because we know there are issues with figures coming from a phone survey. The second point is that the survey results for 2021 is compared with the survey results for 2019. And we are comparing an interview survey result that comes from phone interviews and a survey result that was conducted on the field. So we have to be cautious about that as well. In the employment overall, we can see that in 2018, so it compares October to December of 2021 with October to December of 2019. Why we don't compare with 2020? Because of COVID. There was no survey conducted in 2020. Unemployed people, the number of unemployed people increased from 11% to 16%. So we roughly have a 5 percentage point increase in the number of unemployed people. In the unemployment, if we compare figures for rural and urban areas, we see a twin peak here. In the rural areas, in urban areas, we have a spike in number of unemployment, whereas in the rural areas, the increase in number of unemployment is not so predominant, so strong. And the explanation for this could be that in rural areas, because of improved security situation, a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to participate in the labor market, now because of improvement in security situation as a result of Taliban's takeover, some people would participate in the labor market. But in urban areas, in fact, we could interpret it in a way that the main loser of a state collapse like this is the urban areas, because it is the urban areas that were dependent on the foreign sector. It is the urban areas that contributed the larger share of public sector employment, and it is the urban areas who would work in NGO and aid-related organizations. So with the collapse of the country, all these formal sector collapse, and as a result, we see an increase in unemployment for the urban areas. It is not just unemployment. If we look, what I argued about the rural-urban division in terms of unemployment, we can clearly see that the major portion of the unemployment is driven by increase or shrinking in the formal sector. The salaried private and salaried public, both for the urban areas, we see an increase in types of a reduction in the type of employment from these two areas. The share of self-employed for both urban and rural areas increased substantially. And we know what it means for an economy like Afghanistan. We could interpret self-employed 1 hour daily as self-employment to 8 hours of daily as self-employment. So with the increase in the share of number of people reporting that they are self-employed, we can inference the vulnerability that it could cause. Because as I said, self-employment could be 1 hour, 2 hours, or 10 hours. And as a result, we can infer the consequences of such an increase in self-employment. Not only that the unemployment has increased in both rural areas and urban areas, with urban areas having the highest share of unemployment, the quality of employment has also reduced. If we look at the wages, for example, if you compare private and public salary employment, 71% of people reported that their wages have substantially reduced. Well, we don't know what does that substantial reduction mean, because it is not hard figures. It is a self-reported measure, asking people, if you compare your earnings with the last 30 days, do you think your earnings has increased, decreased, or substantially decreased? We see that people report that 71% of people report that their wage has reduced substantially. And that is the case for both rural and urban areas, with urban areas having the highest percentage of people reporting that their earnings has reduced. And this also, again, it supports the premise that as a result of the state collapse, it is the urban areas that have been predominantly affected negatively. Food security. When there is a spike in unemployment and reduction in wages or deterioration of the quality of employment, we would definitely expect that people's food security should be affected. And that's the case. This figure compares May of 2021. The orange dots are for May of 2021, and the greenish dot color is for October, December of 2021. And it asked, if you ask, is your income enough to meet daily food? In October to December 2021, just few months after the fall of the government, 37% of the surveyed people report that their income was not enough. Whereas in just few months before the collapse, we see that only 15% reported their income was not enough to meet daily food necessities. And we're talking a matter of few months. Unfortunately, we don't have information yet as of now for the major portion of 2020. This compares just few months before and just few months after the fall. And if we see such a drastic deterioration in food security in just few months after the fall, we could only imagine what would mean after, several months after the fall. And so if we combine these two figures, nearly 70% of people report that their income is not enough for essential necessities. And the figure on the right compares how people would then cope. If your income is not enough to meet the daily necessities, your food necessities, how do you cope with that? 85% of people in December to October reported that they would reduce food quantity. So instead of serving 3 meals a day, they would serve 2 meals a day. So they have reduced the quantity of food they would serve. They also not only reduce this one, I take my word back. It is for the quality. They reduce the quality. Instead of a high quality rice, they would bring it to a low quality rice. But they also reduced the quantity of food on the table, and reduce the number of meals, for example. Another coping strategy they adopted is borrowing. Well, borrowing in Afghanistan is mainly from local lenders, family members, or selling of assets. There are anecdotal evidence that a few months after the fall of the government, the markets in Kabul are full of household supplies. People selling their household supplies. And we know that there is a limit for sale of household supplies. Once household supply is over, then people will resort to more hard assets, like selling their houses. The housing prices has reduced considerably since then because of the supply and because a lot of people, a considerable portion of urban poor has resorted to sell off their assets. What has been somehow a success story is the healthcare. We can see that in the overall the number of people who would say that they have access to health in private or public hospitals has not changed since for both male and female. Around 53% of both male and female would say that they have access to private health centers. And if we combine overall for both rural and urban areas, the number of people who report that if they needed any health services, they would have been able to access. This is the only area that we don't see a reduction in welfare or in access to health services, and that is because immediately after the fall of the government, the UN allocated $206 million for the health sector, and they immediately took over paying the salaries of the health service providers, and that is nearly 53.5% of them was supplied by pay. In the United Nations, designed an interim support for health emergency response, and they would cover the entire health sector. And WFP, UNICEF, and other UN-related organizations would then intervene to take over what would otherwise be provided by the previous Afghan government. In early 2022, the World Bank released an approach called the Afghanistan Approach 2.0, and that they provide for education, health, agriculture, and some aspects of financial sector. And health is one of the areas that the World Bank and the UN has covered pretty satisfactorily. And that's why, as a result, we see that the health sector has performed, or at least stood at par with that of before the fall of Afghanistan Republic. And we should be careful that evacuation of health personnel in the long run will put its footprints, and that's not something that even aid would recover. Education is something that everyone has heard so much. In 2021, there were 9.6 million school-aged kids going to school, out of which 4 million were girls. And out of the 4 million school-going girls, 11.14% of them are completely denied from education. Those in the secondary school are completely denied from education. And that then in turn would affect the economy negatively by at least $500 million. As per the UNICEF's estimation, if the 3 million girls would go to school, the contribution of those 3 million girls going to school would be $4 billion in the economy. And that's something that the Taliban either do not understand or understand but still resist based on their ideological basis. So to summarize the two macro and micro analysis of the Afghan economy after the fall of the government, a significant portion of the shock comes from the reduction in aid, and that translates into a reduction, an increase in malnutrition, maternal mortality, migration, and health system is scrambling health system, and that is what we know. Of course, the economy has stabilized, but it has stabilized to a lower equilibrium. In that equilibrium, people are poor. A lot of people are getting poorer. There's a substantial urban to rural displacement. Over the last 20 years, we had people moving from rural areas to urban areas for employment. Now we see a reverse migration from urban areas to rural areas. And not only that, we have substantial increase in people migrating to the neighboring countries. So, according to Amartya Sen, this kind of equilibrium is called a famine equilibrium, where a lot of people would barely live on survival, and that is a situation like famine. What can be done, and what are challenges? Of course, we have seen, and people have asked a lot from the Taliban to work for the improvement of the country. I think it is time to stop requesting or asking anything from the Taliban, because we know their stance is very clear. They are an ideological regime, and their stance is to first satisfy their ideological basis, and that's where they derive their power sources. I think it is irrational to rely on the Taliban for any policy changes. The 2 years long negotiation process proved it, and 1 year of them practically being in power proved it, that there's no flexibility in their approach to the economic management or cooperation in any way whatsoever. My recommendation is to the aid agencies, the international organizations such as the UN and the World Bank, and their government partners such as the United States government, is that the Taliban are in power and they have influence on aid distribution. And we know that in Afghanistan, even with the Taliban, the ethnic geography and ethnicity distribution across Afghanistan's provinces determines who will get aid and who will not get aid. I think it is up to the donor organizations to have a strong monitoring on the geographic distribution of aid, so that the disparity that we see in the distribution of aid is minimized. It could be done through establishing a steering committee. Like recently, the United States, Swiss government, and some Afghan experts established a fund for Afghanistan to transfer the $3.5 billion Afghanistan's central bank's reserves in the US and transfer to the Swiss Bank for International Settlement. And this committee will sort of act as a central bank of Afghanistan in exile, where the committee will have will have the 100% control on the disbursements of funds for the benefit of the Afghan people, not the Taliban regime. Similar institutions could be established to watch over the distribution of aid. That's my talk for today.
Thank you. And finally, the last presentation would be from Farah Fasir, who will be speaking on political economy of the Taliban group.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Dr. Sadr, for moderating this discussion and CGM for providing the platform. And thank you to my colleagues for providing this what has been happening in the last year, which will substantiate some of the claims which I will make in this presentation. So I want to just zoom out from the past year and go a little bit into the history and take you through quite a bit of history of Afghanistan and what has been happening to the past regimes in Afghanistan and what can we say about that the Taliban regime in the past 1 year with regard to the Taliban. So I will go through very quickly. I will start from the independence of Afghanistan in 1919 and what kind of the social contract was dominant in Afghanistan throughout the history and what the Taliban rule means. Is it compatible with the social contract of Afghanistan or not? So for the first part, I will go through very quickly a very kind of quick snapshot of the history of Afghanistan. My entry point is sustainability as compatibility of any rule with the socio-political structure of any society or the social contract of any society. For that, I will go through the evolution of Afghanistan's social contract very quickly. Beginning in the 20th century, post-independence, Afghanistan had a kind of traditional social contract, which I call it a minimalist social contract, which the characteristic of which is Afghanistan was an agrarian economy. So the provinces were kind of self-sufficient economically, and there was little need for engagement between the center and the peripheries in the provinces. So it is a minimalist, and the relationship between the state and society is kind of regularized in a term of patron-client relationship between the traditional elites such as Maliks, Khan, Arbab, and this kind of traditional elites. So this social contract is very much cost-effective and very efficient at the time because there is little need for engagement between the center and the periphery. So it continues well through the 1960s. So there is no problem of incompatibility in terms of politically, because at the time, the political legitimacy of Afghanistan comes from the lineage dynasty. So if you are from the lineage, then there is no kind of challenge for you from the people. I want to compare two eras in the history of Afghanistan, which is Amanullah Khan rule and the Zahid Shah's rule. The first one is very turbulent, and the Zahid Shah rule is very stable. And I want to argue what is the reason for this kind of divergence. Amanullah Khan actually started a series of social reforms, which were very radical and kind of witnessed some kind of backlash from the society. So in terms of the compatibility, what that I argue is Amanullah Khan reform was not, it was socially incompatible, not politically incompatible, because we don't have the problem of political incompatibility at the time. But the Zahid Shah rule is, it is called also as the golden age of peace and stability, because Zahid Shah is more kind of moderate in terms of the values, how he approaches the values of the society, and also in terms of politically, he doesn't face any kind of this legitimacy problem. So the Zahid Shah rule is very stable, but Amanullah Khan is faces backlash because of that social incompatibility. But and the key for the sustainability of the Zahid Shah rule is social and political compatibility. So if we go forward into the 1950s, mid 20th century, Afghanistan faces some kind of, there is a changing world, there is Afghanistan is introduced to the modern ideals. There is new ideologies such as Islamism and Marxism, which enter the society. So the expectation from the state is increased in society. So there is more need for engagement between the state and society, which is in contrast with the traditional social contract of the society. So there is a need for a formal and institutional engagement between the state and society, and that's why we have the decade of democracy in Afghanistan. The institution of the constitutional monarchy, which is the last decade of Zahir Shah's rule. And the characteristic of this decade is, the main characteristic is the 1964 Constitution of Afghanistan, which recognizes the basic rights of the citizens and allows for a modern and independent parliament, which limits the power of the royal family, and it is a kind of very progressive step in the history of Afghanistan. So for the first time, possibility for the direct engagement between state and society is created. So we have a kind of democratic social contract in Afghanistan instead of the traditional social contract. But in this decade, in the last decade of Zahir Shah, there are some problems also, which the society faces. For example, economic stagnation is there, lack of job opportunities. In the 1960s, we have new revolutionary Marxist and Islamist movements which enter the society, and we have new political movements which are kind of more universal in terms of ideology and other things. And so we have new classes of urban elites, which is kind of replacing the traditional elites, which were more landed, like Khans and other groups. And also this opens the possibility for the radical means for change of regime, such as coup d'etats and revolutions and other ways. So what is the reason for unsustainability of this decade? I argue it is political incompatibility. And what is the reason for that? Because the reforms were very gradual, which does not reflect the evolving structure of Afghan society at the time. And also the reforms are also not co-inclusive to accommodate all these Marxist and Islamist ideologies. So that's why, again, we have problem of unsustainability. Then we have Dawood coup d'etat in 1973 against the king, and we have, so the end of this democratic reform is reversed. This process of constitutional monarchy is reversed, and Dawood establishes a very highly centralized role, which he calls republic, but it is very centralized. But what Dawood faces, he sidelines the communist battles which helped him to make a coup d'etat against the king. He sidelines them, and it causes this South revolution against the communist camps and revolt against the Dawood in 1978. Again, what is the reason for unsustainability of the Dawood rule? It is political incompatibility, because he does not accommodate all these political forces into his government, these leftists. So, and Dawood coup d'etat is considered as a kind of a vicious cycle of instability for the next 3 decades. Then we have Soviet-backed communist rules and anti-Soviet liberation war in Afghanistan, or jihad, which is in the 1980s. Again, the communist governments were very extreme in terms of cultural and social economic policies, looking down on the traditional values of the people, and that's why their rule is not sustainable. And what is the reason for unsustainability of the communist rule? It is socio-cultural incompatibility, not the political incompatibility. So we see that some of the regimes face a backlash because of the cultural or social incompatibility, some of the regimes because of political incompatibility. And so we have the start of the anti-communist war, and this shapes a new dynamic in the history of the country. For example, in the war which we have here against the communist government, all the ethnicities of Afghanistan is participating. So it is a national liberation war, and this leads to the political awakening of non-Pashtun ethnicities. which were historically sidelined from the politics of the country. And this shapes a new kind of inter-ethnic power dynamics in the country, which this historical Pashtun dominance in the country is challenged during this war, because these other sideline ethnicities are also mobilizing themselves and kind of getting the political awareness. So we see in practice the reflection of these dynamics in the 1990s. And then in the 1990s, we have rise of non-Pashtun elites, which challenges the Pashtun-centric role in Afghanistan. For example, a reflection of this dynamic is a coalitional government under the presidency of a non-Pashtun, a Tajik Burhanuddin Rabbani in 1992. For the first time, which is the second non-Pashtun role in the history of Afghanistan after a short period in 1929. So again, the Mujahideen government also is not sustainable. There is disagreement in the power sharing mechanism. It faces a backlash. And what is, again, the reason for unsustainability of that, which is political incompatibility, because all the groups are not incorporated within this power sharing mechanism. Then we have the rise of the Taliban in 1996, which is mostly Pashtun dominated. But again, we have another, this post-Soviet war dynamic is again playing out, and we have another coalition of non-Pashtun ethnicities under a prominent Tajik commander, Ahmad Shah Massoud, in the resistance against the Taliban. So we see that in the 1990s, after the Soviet war, this historical Pashtun dominance is challenged, and kind of this Pashtun-centric social contract is no longer working in the country, and we need for some kind of new social contract which should accommodate all the ethnicities of the country. So we in post-2001, just I will go quickly through this one. So in post-2001, we have American intervention, but there is again a bad medicine for the country. In the post-Soviet war, we should have had a kind of decentralized system of governance, which should accommodate all the ethnicities and this post-war dynamics of the country. But American intervention installs a very highly centralized state in the country, which has its own reasons. And one of the problems is that it gives a very unbounded discretionary power to the president. And the president abuses this power to make coalition, this patron-client relationship coalition with other ethnicities. So my argument is that the reason for the failure of this post-2001 state building is this incompatibility between the formal and informal institutions. We have an informal order which is kind of more in lines of a federal system, but formally they adopted a very centralized political system in the form of a republic. And that is my argument, that it leads to the widespread corruption and kind of all sorts of patronages at all government level, which again negatively affected the legitimacy of the government and strengthened the Taliban insurgency. So again, the main source of unsustainability of this rule is mainly political incompatibility, because it is not accommodating all the forces in the country. It is not so much cultural or social. Then we have the Taliban rule, the return of the Taliban. My argument is, in light of all these historical facts, that the Taliban are not compatible with the society of Afghanistan, both politically and socially. We have absolute political incompatibility because all the non-Pashtun elites are excluded from the Taliban government, including the non-Talib Pashtuns. So it is only Taliban rule. So that is an absolute incompatibility, but in terms of social incompatibility, it is relative. The Taliban rule is incompatible with the urban life of the Afghanistan, but it is somewhat compatible with the rural areas, especially in some parts of the country. So it does not reflect the civic values which were created in the past 2 decades. It does not respond to the aspirations of the mass urban youth. and also the issue of women education rights and other things. So it is a kind of twofold or two-dimensional incompatibility. So also, if we zoom out from these structural issues and see at the current issue, we see that Taliban are facing this kind of ongoing challenges. For example, a military resistance, persistent protests from the women rights activists, a brain drain is there in the country, most of the human capital is out of the country, lack of skills in governance, a worsening economic condition, and lack of ability to demonstrate cutting ties with international terrorist groups. So, what can we say about the rule of the Taliban at the end as a conclusion in light of this historical factors? The conjecture is that Taliban rule is totally incompatible with the society of Afghanistan, both politically and also socially. And what is the way forward? Either the Taliban have to yield to the legitimate demand of the inclusive government in the form of a decentralized state to survive in the short run, or they should be ready to face an internal depreciation and gradual demise. So I do not see any prospect for the sustainability of their role in the current form. That is my conclusion. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for all the presentations. Probably now we will have a question and answer session. And if I use the opportunity as a moderator, let me ask you, each one of you, one question, and then we will move towards the audience. The first question is to Mirwais. You explained all sorts of macro financial indicators, fiscal indicators, including GDP, international trade, inflation, exchange rate. My question is that, to a large extent, most of the commentators blame the very dire humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan on the international community's economic sanctions on the Taliban. To what extent do you analyze the macro fiscal policies of Taliban exacerbating the same humanitarian catastrophe? What is the share of Taliban in that?
Well, that's an important question. To be in short, the Taliban has a big role in that, in dire humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Afghanistan, for a number of reasons. To highlight it, I would like to give you a more detailed overview of the Taliban's extraction of revenue from the Afghan economy. As I said, the economy is very small. It is now roughly $40 billion. But the Taliban are extracting resources for their survival from this subsistence economy at an increasingly higher rates. At least they are getting resources from some 9 to 12 sources from the economy. That I put all of these in 4 categories. The first category of their resource extraction is through formal taxation. Direct taxation, indirect taxation, they have their personal income taxes, corporate taxes, business receipt taxes. These were the things that they were there during the Republic also. But in this category, the Taliban have introduced certain other elements of taxation, which are both in the rural economy, as well as on the urban centers. In the rural economy, the Taliban has introduced land taxes, which were very insignificant or not there during the Republic. Also, in the rural economy, they are now taxing the agricultural products. The wheat and other sort of agriculture produce are being rapidly taxed at an increasing rate by the Taliban now. In the urban centers also, the Taliban have introduced new sorts of taxation. Primarily in the urban centers, they have been taxing households as well as the PT traders and business persons in Kabul, Herat, and other major cities. There is something that they have introduced on households called Kitabche Safai, which means the clearance notebooks, that Each household in Kabul and all other cities across Afghanistan are asked to pay some amount to the Taliban government based on the proportion of the area of land that their houses occupies in cities. That's one. Second, they have increased service fees. The ministries in the centers, in the major cities that delivering services, the service fee by them has increased by at least 300 to 400%. For example, a marriage certificate would cost only 300 rupees during the Republic. And now if you get the same document from the Taliban's administration, it costs 1,000 rupees, Afghani rupees, which is 300% more than during the Republic. Similarly, for the ID cards, they have increased fees by some 300% for the passport and other major services. That's the second. The third one is that they are taxing the PT street vendors also, the taxi drivers. A taxi driver is commuting the passengers from one part of the city to another. For example, if a taxi driver goes from Kote Sangeeta to Darlaman, reaching Darlaman, he has to pay some 10, 20 rupees to Taliban municipal person standing there. And also the street vendor who have a small cart and they are selling vegetables that they hardly earn 100 or 200 a day, they are being asked by the Taliban municipal that they should pay some 2,000 to 2,500 per month to the Kabul municipality. So this is the trend on the formal side of the taxation. The second group of taxation that they have introduced is the informal taxation. And that is mostly charities, religious charities, which we call Ushur and Zakat. Before the Taliban takeover of power, these Ushur and Zakat were not there. If they were there in rural economies, in rural areas, they were collected by the Taliban themselves. But now the Taliban are trying to formalize this informal taxation also. They have they have prepared a document and sent to their supreme leader for endorsement, according to which they will formalize Ushur and Zakat, and therefore they will redirect these resources to the central government's treasury. The point is that these Ushur and Zakat payments in rural areas in Afghanistan, they were an inbuilt features of the rural communities, villages, through which the ultra poor segments of the society would often survive through these transfers from the better off segments of the society. But now the Taliban are redirecting that amount also from the very poor to the central government's treasury. The third source of Taliban's revenue is what I call rent. The government, during the Republic government, was a rent seeker in terms of dependence on foreign aid. But now, besides getting some informal payments from some countries, mostly the Arab world, the Taliban are also extracting Afghanistan's natural resources and selling those resources at significantly lower prices. There is no demand for Afghanistan natural resources because of some sanctions, blockades on international trade. The only buyer of Afghanistan resources is Pakistan. So Pakistan is buying at a very cheap price Afghan school and other mineral resources, and the Taliban are happily extracting and sending all those to Pakistan. That's the third major source. And the fourth major source of revenue for the Taliban is the illicit economy. The Taliban have been producers and traffickers of opium and money launderers in the past, and they are continuing to be so right now as a government. Recently, they have ordered banning the cultivation of opium in Afghanistan, but that was strategically done in favor of the Taliban because, according to some informal sources, the leaders of the Taliban, including their deputy prime minister, they have huge reserves of opium in Kandahar and Helmand. And when they formally ban the production of opium and trafficking, that would mean that they are holding a monopoly over those illicit source of income. And therefore, the prices of drug now in Afghanistan has skyrocketed to some 300%. So that benefits, again, the Taliban, a huge benefit from this illicit economy. So this in short is how they are extracting revenue from a subsistence economy under different titles. But as I discussed during my presentation, when it comes back to delivering services to the people, they are not delivering anything. There is no major development project being started by the Taliban. And also, the ordinary expenditures of the government are not being paid by them, but by the UN. Basic services, as Ahmad Shah mentioned during his presentation, are being taken care of by the UN, like health, education, some small rural development projects. So these significant resource extraction at the end of the day would mean that higher poverty and huge humanitarian crisis, and that has recently been reflected in data as well. A very recent survey by the UN shows that despite all these humanitarian aid being delivered by the UN and international community, the poverty level has increased. The number of people under humanitarian catastrophe has increased. Now, at least 97% of the population of Afghanistan live below poverty level. And that comes when the UN has provided some 3.5 billion of humanitarian aid over the past 14 months to the Taliban. And that includes some 1.7 billion in cash shipments. But despite that, you see that humanitarian catastrophe is looming and poverty is increasing. Therefore, there is something wrong in the Taliban's approach of dealing with the economy. And that is what perhaps over-extracting and overtaxing the economy, while not being able to deliver back in terms of services. And at the end of the day, I think if this trend continues, I think very soon we will witness that the Taliban, the economy of Afghanistan will not withhold this overtaxation pressure by the Taliban. And also, as a result of all these looming humanitarian catastrophe, we see that people have been left with a few choices, very negative coping mechanisms, like selling their daughters, early marriages, or the young people being like forced to illegal migration. Even the suicide rate is increasing in Afghanistan, and also the domestic crime rate is rapidly increasing in Afghanistan. And that's perhaps because of the overtaxation of the economy and huge unemployment and the Taliban's lack of taking responsibility and accountability and doing something about that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Second question to Ahmad Shah. You spoke about the welfare impact of state collapse. Now, the simple question is, what does welfare means for the Taliban, if it has any meaning?
Thanks to Parsa, he simplified, basically he did my job answering this question. Welfare for any government means power. All right. And the government wants to stay in power because they want to have access to resources. And for a democratic state, let's say the United States, for a political party to remain in power, they have to satisfy the population through economic prosperity. When people are happy economically during a party's rule, then they will probably vote for the same political party in the coming elections. That's how the political parties maintain their dominance over the politics of the country. For a totalitarian regime, such as the Taliban, of course, remaining in power is the ultimate goal. But to remain in power, in addition to economic prosperity of the people that other countries use as an instrument to remain in power, the Taliban has the ideological instrument. For them, satisfying their political bases, their patrons, through whom they came to power, that is the main source of remaining in power. And for them, for example, if we look at the rural southern and eastern of Afghanistan, culturally, they do not want women to go to school. All right. And that is important for Taliban to accommodate, because the Taliban came to power predominantly from those areas. And so I think for the Taliban, welfare means remaining in power, and they understand that remaining in power means satisfying their patrons through addressing their other ideological and cultural values. And I think that's what has led the Taliban to pay lesser attention to the economic aspects. Let me give you two examples. For example, if the Taliban would care about the overall economic welfare, they would respond positively to the international communities to form an inclusive government. They would know that if by forming an inclusive government, international aid will pour in the country, and as a result, there will be an improvement in the economic welfare of people at large. Taliban are not doing that because apparently they don't care about the economy. Secondly, second example is education. These education and inclusive governments are the two demands from the international communities. If the Taliban would care about the economic welfare, they would consider the recommendation from the UNICEF that I presented, that 3 million girls going to school would contribute around $3.5 billion to the economy. Not only that, if Taliban would allow women to go to school, international community would then also cooperate. They would also pour aid into Afghanistan. So I think the Taliban solely relies on their ideology, and serving their ideological basis is, according to them, the only source that they can remain in power. And economic management, economic prosperity of people at large is something that we don't see, at least we have not seen over the last 1 year.
All right, for those of the audience who are probably not following the Taliban, a couple of months ago, Chief Justice of Taliban, Abdulhakim Haqqani, came up with a booklet explaining the ideology of Taliban, wherein in that booklet, he outlines two types of state and clearly differentiate an Islamic ideological state from that of a welfare democracy, saying the first one is not supposed to provide welfare. The Islamic state is not supposed to provide welfare to people. It's only a state of guidance. It outlines certain provisions of public morality and enforces on the people. And the later one, which is democracy, is of course a welfare. So you see, when it comes on concretely based on ideology of Taliban, the ones who are in top responsibilities, they have a clear mind how to run the state and what type of state they aim for. Anyway, so the last question to Tarek, if I may ask, is given the two presentations on the free fall of economy of Afghanistan, do we have any institutional solution for how to address this crisis in terms of economics?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sadr. I think it's a very deep question and not easy to answer because as we see the situation, Taliban are not responding to the demands of international community and also the other elites in the country. And from my perspective, the only way forward is either Taliban should yield to the legitimate demand to form an inclusive government in the form of a decentralized state, because now all the elites of the country and most of the international community also have realized that a centralized state is not a good solution for Afghanistan, because in the past 20 years we had a very centralized state with lots of aid, international aid supporting it, but it was not possible to sustain it on the social structure of Afghanistan, which is more decentralized. So my argument is the only way forward is for international community to pressurize the Taliban maximally, to pressurize them to yield to a kind of political settlement which is more decentralized and more inclusive and includes all the segments of the society and politicians, and that is the way forward. Otherwise, I do not see any potential for the reform of the Taliban. Some people distinguish between soft liners and hardliners. I don't believe in that. When it is kind of fundamental issues, the issue of their survival and the power, they are all hardliners. Only with regards to the very minor issues, some of them might object to that broader policy, for example, girls' education, a very negligible portion of the Taliban which doesn't have that influence on the main body, on the mainstream body. So for me, the only way forward is change of the political system, shifting to a decentralized kind of government and forming of an inclusive government. Otherwise, I do not see any short-term solution for that.
All right, I think we have 5 minutes if we can have a question from audience. Any question on the? Yeah, please.
I had a question for you. I thought it was quite interesting that you said the healthcare sector is one of the only ones that is doing well. In our last week's conversation, we talked about how doctors that are men cannot treat women, and that the movements between sexes is heavily moved and so on. So I was wondering how the healthcare system is still doing well, and if by doing well, does that also include women, since women cannot be treated by government, and like what goes into the part of the healthcare system doing well?
It is more about the access. In fact, World Bank figure shows that women's access to inpatient and outpatient healthcare services has increased more than that of men. I think it is mainly driven by the amount of aid that is poured into this sector, and as I mentioned in the last part of my presentation, in that section, in the health section, is that the drawdown or the capital flight in the health sector is alarming. A lot of health professionals have already left the country, and it continues to do so. I think aid could only hold the sector so much. But if we don't have doctors on the ground, as you said, if we don't have female doctors allowed by the Taliban to go to visit, to provide services, I think in a year or two, that sector that seemingly shows some positive sign will also collapse.
Any other question? I think there's no question. That's all. I think. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentations, and thank you for participation and listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.